Hey guys, this is Glenn. I'm a 3D artist here at SpaceX Games, and today I'm going to be running through a time lapse of me texturing an asset to talk about techniques I use to hand paint textures. So for the purposes of this exercise, the mesh has already been made and a unique 0 to 1 UV unwrap has been made also. So I've chosen this prop because it consists of a few different materials: brick, wood, metal, grass, just so I can show you my approach to these different surfaces. So we're starting off with the brick texture here, just planning out where the bricks are going to go, trying to make them nice and quite rounded and interesting, not being too neat at the moment, that'll come later. Just edging the wood, edging the metal, just planning out the texture, where the big facets lie. Again with the bricks, adding a few cracks. So the brick surface is actually a cold surface, so we start with a blue underlayer, and then we start just adding in the big light and dark facets, presuming that the light is going to come in from the top left. So because it's a diffuse only texture, obviously we're putting all the lighting information in the texture itself. So at this point, actually, for the majority of the texture, I use a nice soft square brush. Just keep the opacity and the flow around 50, 60. Gives it a bit of nice texture, but you can still use it quite easily for fine edging and cracks. So now I'm painting on light and dark facets, light at the bottom of the facets, dark on the top. It just really helps those edges pop. It's making them a little bit crisper as well, but we're still not being too neat at this stage. So now we'll go in, white, almost a white and almost a black brush, just adding in edges, working in the cracks, working in the edges, and also working in some extra facets on the surface of the bricks, so they're not all just flat. Gives it a little bit more interest. Again, still not being amazingly neat. I just find because these are quite organic surfaces, you don't really need to be incredibly neat with it. So really at this stage, you're just really almost trying to outline the facets that are there, just help them pop as much as possible. So also a few smaller stones in between the bigger stones. It just really helps to break it up. If you actually look at a brick wall in real life, it's not just big thick bricks and nothing in between. Just gives it a little bit more interest. Just starting to give a little bit of shade to the facets where they actually retreat into the mortar, or where the mortar would be. They're not just brilliant white or brilliant black. So the dark facets, you can actually add a little bit of light to them, and it just helps them read a little bit better. The light facets, you're just adding a little bit of dark just to give it a little bit of depth. At this stage as well, I'm still focusing on adding in the cracks, adding in the highlights. So you're really trying to bring as much depth as possible at this stage into the bricks. I'm also shading the facets that I created in the last step, just trying to blend them in a little bit better. So this is making the bricks feel like they have a little bit more shape to them. So all the time I'm literally just colour picking from the nearest colour that I want. This probably dilutes the colour a little bit, but I'm not really too worried about it at this stage. It just makes it really nice, quick, easy, especially for blending. You can actually turn the flow down on your brush a little bit, and this helps. So now I'm going to do another layer on top of this, just doing various shades of grey, just flat colouring the bricks. This layer is going to be set to soft light, and it just gives a bit of variance to the brick tone. And then I'm doing a colour layer on top and just block colouring in the bricks, yellows, reds, oranges, maybe some purples or blues, just to give the bricks a little bit of variance, because obviously not every brick should be the same shade of blue. Now I'm just adding another colour layer with some soft greens in the cracks to indicate mould or damp. It just helps it blend in nicely with the trim below it. You can actually bake out the AO in Maya or wherever, but I decided to paint it to get a little bit more control over it. Straight up black where the shield's going to be, bit of black where the trims are going to be. This is all just on a multiply layer on the top of my stack, which I'll keep coming back to later. So now, brick trim at the bottom, exactly the same techniques as before, so you're just focusing on shading the assets, dark to light, obviously reverse to convention really, so the lighter part of the facet would be at the bottom, the darker part at the top. Don't worry about being too smooth with the shading, with the rendering. I find that if you're a little bit rough, it gives a little bit of texture to it, which is really what we want in these textures. So more edging here, trying to be nice and almost organic with it, just being quite rough and quick and not focusing on big sharp edges, or big straight edges rather. Keep going, tightening up any of the cracks. Cracks shouldn't be the same width throughout, they should taper. So again, a soft light layer, whites and darks. Going back up to my multiply layer and adding a bit of AO to that trim, and then also adding soft light layer with white on, just to indicate the direction of the light. Adding a little bit of soft green at the bottom of the bricks, just to help them blend in with the floor. So now I'm going to focus on the wood, so I'll just do a big block colour for the base. Bring back that edging. Now I'm going to just plan out where the grain's going to go. I'm being extremely rough at this moment, just because I know that the grain is going to continually change, so there's no point being neat with it. So just big dark and light lines to indicate where the grain should go. Obviously over a piece like this, it's easy to forget that you're looking at 4 faces and not 1, so you don't want to be too skewed with the grain. You want something nice and easily readable across the surface. So at this stage I figured the grain was it was way too wacky, so I brought it back a little bit. So pretty happy with it, just starting to do some lights around the edges. So with this wood you really want the edges to pop rather than the rendering in the middle to pop. So now I'm going to just start smoothing out the big bits of grain, just rendering between the highlights and the lowlights, focusing on depth, so the grain doesn't just move in the X and Y, it moves in the Z as well. So you're starting to get this nice layered look, just because I'm painting dark next to light, essentially. Adding in a little bit of light edging as I'm rendering, keeping those edges quite sharp. It's pretty easy to start losing your edges on wood. I think you've got to keep painting them in occasionally, and then blending from that. Starting to get pretty happy with the basic form of a lot of it now. So from time to time I'm just coming along and tightening up the edging on this, just adding more whites, more darks. Generally I try and make sure there are some quite nice, interesting notches where the edges of the mesh are going to be. So yeah, anything actually on the edge, concentrate on really tight highlights and lowlights. So on the edge here, I'm also concentrating on how it's going to meet the actual end of the wood. and flowing nicely. So keeping on tightening up the edges and lows in the middle of the wood. It doesn't matter if you have quite a shallow brightness range, but on the edges you really want to go to pretty much black and a very, very pale sort of orange peachy colour. So I'm starting to get pretty happy with that. Keep checking it in the viewport because it's easy to be happy with the texture when it's just all laid out in the EVs, and then you get to the mesh itself and it doesn't read very well. So here I'm doing a very rough, soft, light and dark pass on another layer above this, just concentrating on the very edges of the wood. And then I'm taking this layer and just in the opacity a bit and setting it to overlay, and then that's going to essentially almost drown out a lot of the nitty-gritty detail in the middle of the wood and focus on the detail on the edge of the wood. To help it pop, obviously, to help it pop further, I go through very small, very high opacity brush, just drawing in the edges again, and I'm also making sure to add a little bit of extra detail on the edges, so really fine grain, fine cracks, and also adding a few scratches on top, just to add a little bit more interest on the surface and give it a bit more of a worn look. So I'm getting pretty happy with the wood at this stage, just tidying some stuff up, tidying any blending up, making sure that there's nice depth to it. So now we're moving on to the metal. First and foremost, I paint in darks and lights for the facets of the metal according to where the light would be shining from, which obviously in this case is the top left. So facets go from light to dark, very simple stuff. Yep, check that, that's fine. And then I'm starting to add in the highs and lows. So I've always found painting metal in diffuse textures a particular challenge, and generally speaking I'm not too true to life with it. I essentially just take a couple of broad strokes, aspects of the properties of metal, and I utilise them to try and fake reflections looking kind of believable. One of the most notable properties of metal is the sharp high and low highlights that you'll get on surfaces. Even when surfaces are in shadow, you'll get highlights on them. Even when they're in full sunlight, you'll get darks on them. So essentially, I take a flat metal surface and I do a highlight band and a low light band or a shadow band, and then I start blending these together. Generally speaking, this is very trial and error for me, so I'll do some rough highs, lows, go into my viewport, check how it looks. Yeah, so here I'm just being not amazingly tidy with it. To be honest, I could be even rougher than this. Just doing lights and darks. Lights I do generally keep to the edges of facets, and then darks somewhere in the middle. You'll actually see that I'll go over these same facets a few times over these videos because I'm just not happy with how it actually looks in the viewport. Remember that dark side of the mesh will still receive bounce light, so there'll still be reflections on it. So that looks about right to me where those are, so start blending them in. So at this stage I'm just working in grayscale. I'm focusing on the brightness of the light rather than the colour of the reflected light. Just blending these in. And now I'm just adding some very fine white edging on the edges of the facets. Generally speaking, you want to be a bit brighter where the light's going to hit the shield, which quite often tends to be near where the highlight is on the opposite facet. And now just doing some very simple rivets, outline them. And now I'm starting to shade them in, just darks. and then some lights on top just to round them off. Obviously you'd get the light coming in from the top left, and then you'd get a little bit of rim light on the opposite side. So just tidying these up, tidying up any shading, and now I'm just adding starting to add a little bit of brown rust in. Starting to look at colour now. So brown, rust, lots of edge scratches, very simple stuff. Just to give it a little bit more interest, give it a little bit more of a worn appearance. Again, just a little bit of brown, just in the crevices, just some scratches, focusing on the edges and the corners and where the shield would have actually got hit. So now I'm going to look at the colour of the reflection. Generally speaking, because this is an outdoor asset, you've got blue reflection for the sky, green for the ground. So this is a colour layer on top of the shading on the shield, just adding a little bit of bounce colour as well from the wood. So now I'm working on the interior of the shield, so just very simple red, and just start shading dark and light. And then a little bit of rim as well. So this is a very reflective surface. The reflection on this doesn't go brilliant white either. There's a little bit of the colour of the surface in it as well. So I'm going back to my AO layer, just adding in where the middle part of that shield is on the AO layer. And now I'm just going to look at just doing some broad strokes adjustments to all the colours. So just some adjustment layers on top. These can be block colours as well, set to colour or soft light. Periodically, I like to just go through and start tying these elements together, because quite often you can focus on one element and you're not really looking at how it sits as a whole. So now I'm going to focus on the grass. So picking my shade of green, my base shade, and then I give it a nice thick facet. So with the grass, I'm going to be using a rounded brush with its size set to fade over its lifetime, and also its colour set to fade from one colour to another over its lifetime. So the first colour is going to be the colour of the grass, the shade of the grass, and then the second colour is going to be a step or two lighter than the grass. And I've also set at the top there my brush layer to lighten. So what this is going to do is it's essentially just going to pop out the edges of the brush stroke rather than the entire thing, and you can actually start layering up grass, as you can see. So I started layering up the grass again, trying not to be too directional about it. You want this grass to be quite organic and bushy and feel quite scruffy. So I take that grass, lower the opacity on it, and then I'm just starting to pop out the very edges of some blades of grass with a light brush. And then I do a darker brush just to paint in some lowlights in places between batches of grass, just so it starts clumping them together. So at this stage I just got a colour layer. I just start doing some yellows and oranges just to break up the colour of the grass a little bit. You can do this blade by blade, or you can just do a broad strokes colour overlay. Painting in some mud, very simple stuff, and then I start focusing on little rocks and stones in the mud, just by taking the colour of the mud and just shifting it lighter or darker and painting in some very simple facets. Blending these in a little bit better. So now I'm just switching back to my tapered brush, adding a bit of a fringe to the grass over the mud, blend that in nicely. At this stage I wasn't quite happy with all the rivets, so just started blending some of those out. If you keep details like this on separate layers, it's quite nice and easy and iterative to come back and edit them. Adding a little bit more rust, a little bit more colour, break up the surface a little bit better. And now I'm just going through and I'm just doing adjustments again. So broad strokes adjustments, simple masks around various parts of the mesh. Maybe a little bit more green on the bottom of them bricks just to blend it into the grass a little bit better. These are generally done on soft light or colour overlays. And now just adjusting the metal. and a little bit of colour variation to the wood, just because that was a little bit one tone before. Just finishing up, adjusting these bricks a little bit so it sits a little bit better. Again, the grass, just helping it all tie together when you look at it in the viewport. Just adding a little bit of a highlight to the grass, and at this stage I'm pretty much done. Just tweaking a few things and tweaking a few adjustment layers just to help metal read a little bit better as metal. So here's the end result. So once again, I've been Glenn for Space 8 Games. I hope you found this video helpful, and thanks for watching.